The afternoon sun beat down on the dusty street of Silver Creek, Wyoming, as Charlotte Meadows stood outside the general store, her hands trembling slightly as she clutched her worn leather satchel. At 23 years old, she'd already buried a husband and lost everything she'd ever known. The money from selling their small plot of land had run out 2 weeks ago, and now she was down to her last few coins. She'd spent the entire morning going from business to business, asking for work, any work. But Silver Creek was a small town, and opportunities for women were limited. "I'm real sorry, miss," old Mr. Henderson had said at the Mercantile. "I just don't have the funds to hire help right now." The boarding house had been the same. The seamstress shop had no openings. The schoolhouse already had a teacher. Even the saloon owner had turned her down for a job washing dishes, saying she looked too refined for that kind of work. Charlotte blinked back tears of frustration. She'd come to Wyoming territory hoping for a fresh start, away from the pitying looks and whispered gossip back in Missouri. Her late husband's debts had stripped her of everything, including her dignity. She'd thought the frontier would offer opportunities, but instead she was finding only closed doors. She walked down the wooden sidewalk, her boots clicking softly, when she noticed a help-wanted sign in the window of a small restaurant. Her heart leaped with hope. She pushed open the door, the bell jingling above her head. Inside, a heavy-set woman with graying hair looked up from wiping down tables. "Excuse me, ma'am," Charlotte said, trying to keep her voice steady. "I saw your sign. I'm looking for work. I can cook, clean, serve tables. I'm a hard worker and I learn quickly." The woman's eyes traveled over Charlotte's threadbare dress and tired face. "You got experience in a restaurant?" "I ran a household for 5 years. I can make just about anything, and I'm good with numbers if you need help with accounts." The woman sighed. "Honey, I'd like to help, but I already promised my sister's daughter she could have the position. She's coming in from Cheyenne next week." "I'm sorry." Charlotte's shoulders sagged. "I understand. Thank you for your time." She stepped back outside into the bright sunshine, feeling the weight of rejection pressing down on her chest. That made 5 places in one day. 5 rejections. She had enough money for maybe 3 more nights at the cheapest boarding house. And then what? She'd be sleeping in the street. She stood there on the sidewalk, trying to compose herself, when she became aware of someone watching her. Charlotte glanced to her left and saw a man leaning against a post outside the saddle shop. He was tall, well over 6 feet, with broad shoulders that stretched the fabric of his chambray shirt. His dark hair curled slightly beneath the brim of his black Stetson, and his face was all hard angles and weathered skin that spoke of years working under the sun. But it was his eyes that caught her attention. They were a striking blue-gray, and they were looking directly at her with an intensity that made her breath catch. She quickly looked away, embarrassed to have been caught staring. She started walking, planning to return to her room and figure out what to do next. But she heard boots on the wooden planks behind her. "Ma'am!" a deep voice called out. Charlotte stopped and turned. The tall cowboy was walking toward her, moving with an easy confidence that suggested he was comfortable in his own skin. Up close, he was even more imposing. The top of her head barely reached his chest. "Yes?" she asked, instinctively taking a step back. He removed his hat, revealing more of that dark, slightly unruly hair. "Name's James Kincaid. Couldn't help but notice you've been going from business to business all morning." Heat rushed to Charlotte's cheeks. Had he been watching her? "I don't see how that's any of your concern, Mr. Kincaid." "No offense intended, ma'am." His voice was low and gravelly, but not unkind. "Just seemed like you might be looking for employment, and I watched you get turned away from 5 different places." Charlotte lifted her chin, trying to maintain some dignity. "Again, I don't see what business it is of yours." "None at all," he agreed, his blue-gray eyes never leaving her face. "But I'm curious. What kind of work are you looking for, Mom?" She hesitated. There was something about this man that made her nervous, but not in a bad way. He was watching her like she was something rare and precious, and it had been so long since anyone had looked at her like that. "Anything honest," she finally answered. "I can cook, clean, sew, keep accounts. I'm educated and I'm willing to work hard." James Kincaid nodded slowly, seeming to consider this. "You got family in Silver Creek?" "No, sir. I'm alone." Something flickered in his eyes at that. "Where are you staying?" "The boarding house on 3rd Street. She didn't mention that she could only afford a few more nights there. He was quiet for a moment, turning his hat in his hands. Charlotte noticed his fingers were long and calloused, the hands of a man who worked with them. He wore no wedding ring. Miss Meadows, Charlotte Meadows. Mrs. Charlotte Meadows, actually. I'm a widow. I'm sorry for your loss, Mrs. Meadows. He said it simply, without the usual platitudes people offered. How long have you been widowed? Nearly a year now. He nodded again, still studying her in that intense way. You mind if I ask you a personal question? Charlotte's heart began to beat faster. That depends on the question. You looking for work? Or are you looking for a husband? The bluntness of it shocked her. Mr. Kincaid, that's hardly appropriate. I mean no disrespect, he interrupted, his voice remaining calm. It's just that Silver Creek has two kinds of women looking for a fresh start. Those who want to make their own way, and those who are looking to marry. I need to know which you are before I make my offer. Your offer? Charlotte's pulse was racing now. What offer? James Kincaid looked down at his hat, then back at her. When he spoke, his voice was matter-of-fact. I own a ranch about 10 miles north of here. It's a good-sized operation, nearly 1,000 acres, with cattle and horses. I've got 3 ranch hands who live in the bunkhouse, but I need someone to manage the main house. Cook meals, keep the place clean, maybe help with the chickens and the garden. It's hard work, but the pay is fair. And you'd have your own room. Charlotte stared at him. You're offering me a job? I am. You don't even know me. No, but I know desperation when I see it. And I know you've been turned away from 5 places today. His blue-grey eyes were steady on hers. I also know I've been looking for household help for 3 months and haven't found anyone suitable. Most of the women in town are already spoken for or aren't interested in ranch work. Why would you offer this to a complete stranger? Because I saw you turn down 5 job offers, he said, a hint of a smile playing at his lips. Wait, that's not right. You didn't turn them down. They turned you down. But I watched you walk out of each place with your head held high. No tears, no complaints. That tells me something about your character. Charlotte's throat tightened with emotion. I don't know what to say. Say you'll think about it, James suggested. I'm in town to pick up supplies. I'll be at the Silver Star Hotel tonight if you want to discuss the details. Room 12. But Mrs. Meadows, I need to be clear about something. What's that? This is just a job. I'm not looking for a wife, and I'm not the kind of man who takes advantage of women in difficult situations. You'd have your own room with a lock on the door, and you'd be treated with respect by me and every man on my ranch. Understood? The relief that flooded through Charlotte was almost overwhelming. A legitimate job, a safe place to stay, a chance to rebuild her life without having to rely on anyone but herself. I understand, she said softly, and I accept. James blinked, clearly surprised. You don't want to think it over? Ask around about me? Make sure I'm not some kind of... I've spent the last year watching people judge me for things that weren't my fault, Charlotte interrupted. You're the first person who's offered me real help without expecting something in return. I'd be a fool not to accept. He studied her for another long moment, then nodded. All right then. Can you be ready to leave tomorrow morning? I'll come by the boarding house at sunrise with the wagon. I can be ready. Good. James put his hat back on, tipping it to her. I'll see you tomorrow, Mrs. Meadows. Mr. Kincaid, Charlotte called out as he started to walk away. He turned back. Thank you. You don't know what this means to me. His expression softened slightly. We'll see if you're still thanking me after a week of cooking for 4 hungry cowboys and dealing with my cantankerous rooster. Despite everything, Charlotte found herself smiling. I think I can handle it. I think you can too, James said quietly, and something in his voice made warmth spread through her chest. She watched him walk away, his long strides carrying him toward the general store. Charlotte pressed a hand to her racing heart. She'd just agreed to live on an isolated ranch with a man she'd only just met. It was either the bravest or most foolish decision she'd ever made. But as she walked back to the boarding house, for the first time in months, Charlotte felt something she'd almost forgotten: hope. The next morning, Charlotte was waiting outside the boarding house with her single trunk and satchel when James Kincaid arrived. The sun was just beginning to paint the eastern sky in shades of pink and gold. He climbed down from the wagon and lifted her trunk like it weighed nothing, settling it in the back. Then he turned to her, offering his hand to help her up onto the seat. Charlotte placed her hand in his and felt the calluses on his palm, the strength in his grip. He lifted her effortlessly, and she settled onto the wooden seat, very aware of how close they'd be sitting for the next 2 hours. James climbed up beside her and took the reins. You have breakfast? No, I wanted to save the money. He reached behind the seat and pulled out a cloth bundle. handing it to her. "Biscuits and bacon from the hotel. You should eat." Charlotte unwrapped the bundle, her stomach growling at the smell. "Thank you. That's very kind. Can't have you fainting on me before we even get to the ranch," he said, but there was no mockery in his tone. They rode in silence for a while. As Silver Creek disappeared behind them, the landscape opened up into rolling hills, dotted with sage and wildflowers. Mountains rose in the distance, their peaks still touched with snow, despite it being late spring. "It's beautiful," Charlotte murmured. "Wait until you see the ranch," James said. "The house sits in a valley with a creek running through it. Best grazing land in the territory." "How long have you owned it?" 5 years. I bought it after I mustered out of the cavalry. Spent 3 years building it up from nothing." Charlotte glanced at him. "You were in the cavalry?" "Yes, ma'am. Served 7 years. He didn't elaborate, and something in his tone suggested he didn't want to talk about it. "Your ranch hands," Charlotte said, changing the subject. "What are they like?" "Good men. Tom's been with me from the start. He's about 50, quiet, keeps to himself. Jake and Samuel are brothers, early 20s, hard workers. They're respectful, but I'll make it clear, you're to be treated like a lady." "I'm not a lady, Mr. Kincaid. I'm a widow who just lost everything. I'm here to work." He turned to look at her, those blue-gray eyes intense. "You're a lady, Mrs. Meadows. Don't let anyone tell you different." The conviction in his voice made her chest tighten. She looked away, focusing on the passing landscape. After another stretch of silence, James spoke again. "Can I ask what happened to your husband?" Charlotte's hands tightened in her lap. "Fever took him. It was sudden. 1 week he was healthy. The next he was gone. I'm sorry. So am I. But it was the aftermath that nearly destroyed me. He'd borrowed money, made investments I didn't know about. When he died, the creditors came. They took everything, the house, the furniture, even my mother's jewelry. I was left with nothing but a trunk of clothes and a few dollars. His family didn't help. They blamed me, said I must have driven him to take risks." The bitterness in her voice surprised her. "They didn't want anything to do with me after the funeral." James was quiet for a moment. "Their loss." Charlotte looked at him sharply, but his expression was sincere. "I mean it," he said. "Any family that would abandon a widow in her time of need isn't worth having." "You seem to have strong opinions about family, Mr. Kincaid." "I do. And you can call me James. We're going to be living under the same roof. Seems silly to stand on formality." "Then you should call me Charlotte." He glanced at her, and she could have sworn she saw the hint of a smile. "Charlotte suits you." "Why do you say that?" "It's an old-fashioned name, proper, but you don't seem like the type who's afraid to get her hands dirty when needed." "You've made quite a few assumptions about me based on watching me for one morning," Charlotte pointed out. "True enough, but I'm usually a good judge of character. Had to be in the cavalry." "What did you do in the cavalry?" "Scouted mostly. Learned to read people, read land, read situations. It kept me alive." Charlotte wanted to ask more, but something in his posture told her the subject was closed. They rode for another hour, the sun climbing higher in the sky. Charlotte found herself oddly comfortable with the silence. James wasn't the type of man who felt the need to fill every moment with conversation, and she appreciated that. Finally, he pointed ahead. "There, that's Kincaid Ranch." Charlotte looked and caught her breath. Nestled in a green valley with mountains rising behind it was a beautiful ranch. The main house was 2 stories, built of sturdy logs with a wide porch wrapping around the front. A red barn stood nearby, along with several other outbuildings. She could see cattle grazing in the distance and horses in a corral. "James, it's wonderful. It's home," he said simply, but she could hear the pride in his voice. As they drew closer, Charlotte saw 3 men emerge from the barn. They stopped and stared as the wagon approached. James pulled the horses to a stop in front of the house and climbed down. He came around to Charlotte's side and offered his hand. She took it and stepped down, very aware of 3 pairs of eyes watching her every move. "Tom, Jake, Samuel," James said, his voice taking on a tone of authority. "This is Mrs. Charlotte Meadows. She's going to be managing the household from now on. You'll treat her with respect and courtesy at all times. Any problems with that?" The oldest man, Tom, removed his hat. "No problem at all, boss, ma'am." The 2 younger men followed suit. "Ma'am," they echoed. Charlotte nodded to them. "Pleased to meet you all. I hope we'll work well together." "I'll show you to your room," James said, lifting her trunk from the wagon as easily as before. "Tom, can you finish unloading the supplies?" "Sure thing, boss." James led Charlotte up the porch steps and through the front door. Inside, the house was larger than she'd expected. The main room had a big stone fireplace, comfortable furniture, and large windows that let in plenty of light. Everything was neat, but had that bachelor quality of being functional rather than welcoming. "Kitchen's through there," James said, gesturing to an archway. "Pantry's well stocked. You'll find chickens out back for eggs, and there's a root cellar. We get our meat from the cattle and hunting. Your room is upstairs." He climbed the stairs, Charlotte following. At the top, he turned right and opened a door at the end of the hall. The room was simple but clean, with a brass bed covered in a colourful quilt, a dresser, a washstand, and a window overlooking the valley. To Charlotte's surprise, there was even a small bookshelf with a few books. "It's not fancy," James said, setting her trunk at the foot of the bed, "but it's clean and private. There's a lock on the door," he demonstrated, showing her the key. "My room is at the other end of the hall. The other two rooms are storage." "It's perfect," Charlotte said honestly. "Better than I expected." James studied her for a moment. "You really didn't have anywhere else to go, did you?" She met his gaze steadily. "No, but I would have figured something out. I always do." "I believe you." He handed her the key. "Get settled. Come down when you're ready, and I'll show you the rest of the house and explain the routine." After he left, Charlotte sat on the bed and looked around her new room. Sunlight streamed through the window, and she could hear birds singing outside. For the first time in a year, she had a safe place to sleep and honest work to do. She pressed her hand to her chest, feeling the tears that she'd been holding back for so long finally spill over. But these weren't tears of despair. These were tears of relief. Charlotte allowed herself 5 minutes to cry. Then she washed her face, unpacked her few belongings, and went downstairs to begin her new life. Over the next 2 weeks, Charlotte settled into a routine at Kincaid Ranch. She woke before dawn to start breakfast for James and the ranch hands, spending her days cleaning, cooking, tending to the chickens and garden, and managing the household accounts that James had handed over to her with obvious relief. The work was hard, but she thrived on it. Every morning when she woke in her clean, safe room, she felt grateful. And every night when she fell into bed exhausted, she felt satisfied in a way she never had before. The ranch hands were respectful, if a bit awkward around her at first. Tom warmed up quickly, often lingering after meals to tell her stories about the early days of the ranch. Jake and Samuel were young and shy, barely able to look her in the eye when they thanked her for meals. But it was James who occupied most of her thoughts. He was different from any man she'd ever known. Quiet and intense, he seemed to notice everything but comment on little. He was scrupulously polite, always thanking her for meals and never entering a room without knocking first. But Charlotte had begun to notice other things, the way his eyes followed her when he thought she wasn't looking, the way he always made sure she had the most comfortable chair by the fire in the evenings, the way he'd brought home fabric from town in case she wanted to make new curtains, but which was exactly the right color for a new dress. Small gestures, thoughtful gestures, gestures that made her heart beat faster. She tried to tell herself it was just gratitude she felt. He'd saved her after all, given her a chance when no one else would. But she was beginning to suspect it was something more. One evening, about 3 weeks after her arrival, Charlotte was washing dishes after supper when she heard raised voices from outside. She dried her hands and went to the window, peering out into the twilight. James was standing near the barn with a man she didn't recognize. The stranger was shorter than James, but stocky, and even from a distance, Charlotte could see the anger in his posture. "I told you, Harlan, you need to leave," James said, his voice carrying across the yard. "You can't just cut me off, Kincaid. I'm family. You're a drunk and a cheat, and I don't want you on my property." The man, Harlan, took a step forward. "You think you're better than me? You think having this fancy ranch makes you respectable? I know what you did in the cavalry. I know why you really left." Charlotte saw James's shoulders tense. "Get out. Not until you give me what you owe me." "I don't owe you anything." Harlan's hand moved toward his hip, and Charlotte's breath caught. Was he reaching for a gun? But James moved faster than she'd ever seen a man move. One moment he was standing still, the next he had Harlan's arm twisted behind his back and was marching him toward a horse tied near the gate. "Leave now, or I'll have the sheriff come get you," James said, his voice deadly calm. "And don't come back." He released Harlan with a shove. The man stumbled, caught himself, and turned back with a snarl. "This isn't over, Kincaid." "Yes, it is." Harlan mounted his horse and rode off into the gathering darkness. James stood there for a long moment, his hands clenched into fists, his shoulders rigid. Charlotte stepped away from the window, her heart pounding. She busied herself putting away the last of the dishes, trying to calm her racing thoughts. A few minutes later, she heard the back door open. James's boots sounded heavy on the wooden floor. Charlotte, she turned. He was standing in the kitchen doorway, his face shadowed in the lamplight. "I saw," she said quietly, "from the window. Are you all right?" "I'm fine." His voice was rough. "Did he scare you?" "No. You handled it." James ran a hand through his dark hair, making it stand up in places. He looked tired. "I should have warned you. Harlan is my cousin. He shows up every few months asking for money. You don't have to explain." "I want to." He moved into the kitchen, leaning against the counter. "Harlan and I grew up together. He was like a brother to me once. But he got into gambling and drinking, and he's made some bad choices. I've helped him before, but he just uses the money for more gambling. I had to cut him off." "That must have been difficult." "It was necessary." James looked at her, his blue-grey eyes searching her face. "He mentioned my time in the cavalry. There are things I did back then, things I'm not proud of. I want you to know that. Everyone has things they regret, James. Maybe, but I need you to understand something." He took a step closer, and Charlotte's breath caught at the intensity in his gaze. "I'm not a good man, Charlotte. I've killed people. I've made mistakes. I'm rough around the edges, and I always will be." "Why are you telling me this?" "Because I see the way you look at me sometimes," he said quietly, "and I need you to understand what kind of man I really am." Charlotte's heart was pounding so hard she was sure he could hear it. "And what kind of man is that?" "The kind who's better off alone." "That's not what I see," Charlotte said, surprised by her own boldness. "I see a man who gave a desperate stranger a chance. A man who treats everyone with respect. A man who built something good out of nothing. That's the kind of man I see, James Kincaid." He stared at her, something raw and vulnerable flickering in his eyes. "Charlotte." Oh, the way he said her name made warmth flood through her entire body. He took another step closer, and suddenly he was right in front of her. So close, she had to tilt her head back to look at him. "You're so small," he murmured, almost to himself. "Top of your head barely reaches my chest." "I'm aware," Charlotte whispered. His hand came up, and for a moment she thought he might touch her face. But he stopped himself, his jaw clenching. "I should go." James, I'll see you at breakfast, Charlotte." His voice was strained. He turned and walked out of the kitchen, his boots heavy on the stairs. Charlotte stood there in the lamplight, her whole body trembling. Something had shifted between them tonight, something that both thrilled and terrified her. She pressed her hand to her racing heart and wondered what would happen next. The next few days were awkward. James seemed to be avoiding her, taking his meals quickly and spending more time out on the range than usual. Charlotte told herself it was for the best. Getting involved with her employer would be foolish. She was here to work, to rebuild her life, not to develop feelings for a complicated man with a troubled past. But her heart didn't seem to care what her head thought was sensible. One afternoon, about a week after the incident with Harlan, Charlotte decided to tackle the overgrown garden behind the house. The spring weather was perfect for planting, and she'd found seeds in the pantry that were going to waste. She was on her hands and knees pulling weeds when she heard hoofbeats approaching. She looked up to see James riding in from the north pasture. He pulled his horse to a stop when he saw her, dismounting in one fluid motion. "What are you doing?" he asked, walking over. "The garden needs attention. I thought I'd plant some vegetables. We could use fresh greens." James looked at the plot of earth, then at her. "This is hard work. You don't have to." "I want to," Charlotte interrupted. "I like gardening. It reminds me of—" She trailed off. "Of what?" "Of before, when things were simpler." She sat back on her heels, brushing dirt from her hands. "My mother and I used to garden together when I was young. It was one of my favorite things." James was quiet for a moment. Then, to her surprise, he tied off his horse and crouched down beside her. "Show me what needs to be done. You don't have to help. I'm sure you have other work. Show me, Charlotte." So she did. They spent the next 2 hours working side by side in the garden, clearing weeds, turning soil, planting seeds. James was surprisingly gentle with the delicate work, his large, calloused hands handling the tiny seeds with care. "You're good at this," Charlotte observed. "My mother had a garden when I was growing up. She made me help." He glanced at her with a hint of a smile. "I complained at the time, but I'm glad she did now." You don't talk about your family much. Not much to tell. Parents are both gone. Just Harlan left. And you saw how that is. I'm sorry. It must be lonely. James looked at her. Something unreadable in his expression. It was, until recently. Charlotte's breath caught. Before she could respond, James stood abruptly. I should wash up. Thank you for the help with the garden. You're the one who helped me, Charlotte pointed out. Then we helped each other. His voice was gruff. He started to walk away, then stopped and turned back. Charlotte, I'm sorry I've been avoiding you. I noticed. I didn't want to make things uncomfortable. You work for me. There's a line that shouldn't be crossed. And what if that line is already blurry? Charlotte asked quietly. James's jaw clenched. Then we need to unblur it. Do you really want that? It's not about what I want. His voice was rough with emotion. It's about what's right. What if being right isn't the same as being happy? He stared at her for a long moment, his blue-grey eyes stormy. You deserve better than a broken man with blood on his hands, Charlotte. Don't I get to decide what I deserve? Not when it comes to me. He walked away before she could respond. Charlotte sat in the garden, her hands covered in dirt, her heart aching. She was falling for James Kincaid, and she was fairly certain he was falling for her too, but he was determined to keep his distance, to protect her from something she didn't need protecting from. She looked down at the newly planted seeds, hidden in the dark earth. Sometimes things needed darkness and patience before they could grow into something beautiful. Maybe this was one of those times. 2 weeks later, on a Saturday morning, James told Charlotte he needed to go into Silver Creek for supplies, and would she like to come along. She agreed immediately, grateful for the chance to see other people and get some air. The ride into town was pleasant, the spring weather warm and sunny. James seemed more relaxed than he had been, pointing out landmarks and telling her stories about the area. In town, they split up. James went to the feed store, while Charlotte visited the mercantile for household goods. She was examining fabric when she heard a familiar voice behind her. Well, if it isn't Charlotte Meadows. She turned to find two women standing behind her, Mrs. Pritchard and her daughter Evelyn, who had been part of the social circle back in Missouri before Charlotte's fall from grace. Mrs. Pritchard, Evelyn. What a surprise, Charlotte said, keeping her voice polite. We heard you'd run off to the territories, Mrs. Pritchard said, her eyes taking in Charlotte's simple dress. Couldn't face the shame of your husband's debts, I suppose. Mother, Evelyn said uncomfortably. But Mrs. Pritchard continued, I always knew there was something off about you, Charlotte. A proper woman would have known what her husband was up to. A proper woman would also know that speaking ill of the dead is unkind, Charlotte replied calmly, though her heart was racing. Are you working? Evelyn asked more gently than her mother. We heard you were looking for employment. I'm managing a household on a ranch north of town. A housekeeper, Mrs. Pritchard sniffed. How the mighty have fallen. Charlotte felt heat rush to her face, but before she could respond, a deep voice spoke from behind her. Is there a problem here? She turned to find James standing there, his face hard as stone. He moved to stand beside Charlotte, close enough that his arm brushed hers. Mrs. Pritchard's eyes widened as she took in James's impressive height and intimidating presence. We were just catching up with an old acquaintance. Didn't sound like friendly catching up to me, James said, his voice dangerously quiet. Sounded like you were being cruel to a woman who's shown more grace and strength than most people ever will. Now see here. No. You see here, James's voice cut like a knife. Mrs. Meadows works for me, and she does an exceptional job. She's smart, capable, and worth 10 of most people I've met. If you can't treat her with the respect she deserves, then I suggest you take your business elsewhere. Mrs. Pritchard's face turned red. Well, I never. That's obvious, James said dryly. He turned to Charlotte. You ready to go? Charlotte nodded, not trusting her voice. James placed his hand on the small of her back, guiding her toward the door. She could feel the warmth of his palm through the fabric of her dress. Outside, she took a shaky breath. You didn't have to do that. Yes, I did. James stopped and turned to face her. What she said was cruel and wrong. She was part of my life before. They all were. When my husband died and the debts came out, they all turned their backs on me. Then they're fools. Charlotte looked up at him, this tall, fierce man who'd defended her without hesitation. Why do you care so much? James's expression softened. Because someone should. And because everything I said in there was true. You are smart and capable and worth 10 of anyone I know. Warmth flooded through Charlotte's chest. James, don't, he said quietly. Don't look at me like that. Like what? Like you're feeling what I'm feeling. And what are you feeling? He stepped closer, his voice dropping. Things I shouldn't feel for someone who works for me. Things that keep me up at night. Charlotte's heart was hammering. What if I'm feeling the same things? Then we're both in trouble. His hand came up, and this time he didn't stop himself from touching her face, his thumb gently brushing her cheek. Because I've been trying so hard to do the right thing, and you make it damn near impossible. Maybe the right thing is letting yourself be happy. I don't know how to be happy, Charlotte. I've spent too many years being angry and alone. Then let me teach you, she whispered. James's eyes darkened. For a moment she thought he might kiss her right there on the street, but instead he dropped his hand and stepped back. We should get back to the ranch. Charlotte wanted to argue, to push harder, but she could see the conflict in his eyes. James was fighting himself, fighting what he felt for her because he thought it was the right thing to do. So she nodded and followed him to the wagon, her heart aching with everything unsaid between them. That night, Charlotte couldn't sleep. She lay in bed, listening to the sounds of the ranch at night, thinking about James and the look in his eyes when he touched her face. Finally, she gave up on sleep and went downstairs to make herself some tea. She was surprised to find lamplight coming from James's study. She knocked softly on the doorframe. James, are you all right? He was sitting at his desk, a half-empty bottle of whiskey in front of him. He looked up and she could see exhaustion in his face. Couldn't sleep, he said. Neither could I. Charlotte stepped into the room. Can I join you? James hesitated, then nodded. There's another glass in the cabinet if you want some whiskey. Tea would suit me better, but I'll keep you company. She settled into the chair across from his desk. For a while they sat in comfortable silence, the only sound the ticking of the clock. I think about you constantly, James said suddenly. Every moment of every day. Charlotte's breath caught. James, let me finish. He leaned forward, his blue-grey eyes intense. I think about how you look in the morning light when you're making breakfast. I think about your laugh when Tom tells his terrible jokes. I think about how brave you were, coming out here with nothing and no one. And I think about what it would be like to hold you, to kiss you, to wake up next to you every morning. Then why won't you let yourself have that? Because what if I'm not enough? His voice was raw. What if the darkness in me drives you away? What if I hurt you or disappoint you? I couldn't bear that, Charlotte. Charlotte stood and walked around the desk. James watched her approach, his body tense. When she reached him, she did something bold. She placed her hands on his shoulders. You're not going to hurt me, she said firmly. And you're already enough, more than enough. James looked up at her, conflict clear in his expression. Charlotte, if we cross this line, there's no going back. I don't want to go back. I want to move forward. With you. He stood abruptly, and suddenly they were inches apart. He was so tall, so broad, that Charlotte had to tilt her head way back to see his face. I'm not a gentleman, he said roughly. I'm hard and I'm broken and you're the kindest person I've ever known, Charlotte interrupted. You've shown me more respect and care than anyone in my entire life. That's who you really are, James. His hand came up to cup her face, his touch gentle despite his words. You undo me, he whispered. Completely undo me. Good, Charlotte breathed, and then he was kissing her, his mouth capturing hers in a kiss that was both tender and passionate. Charlotte's hands fisted in his shirt as she kissed him back, pouring all her feelings into it. When they finally broke apart, both breathing hard, James rested his forehead against hers. I'm going to marry you, he said. If you'll have me. Charlotte's heart soared. That's quite a jump from just a job. I was a fool to ever think I could keep you at arm's length. His arms came around her, pulling her close. I love you, Charlotte. I think I started falling the moment I saw you walking out of that restaurant with your head held high. I love you too, she whispered. And yes, I'll marry you. James kissed her again, this time slower, sweeter. When he pulled back, he was smiling, really smiling, and Charlotte thought it was the most beautiful thing she'd ever seen. You're sure? He asked. You're sure you want a broken-down cavalry scout with a past? I'm sure I want James Kincaid, the man who saw me when no one else would, the man who gave me hope when I had none, the man who just happens to be the person I want to spend the rest of my life with. He lifted her off her feet, holding her close. You're so small, he murmured. I'll have to be careful with you. Charlotte laughed. I'm tougher than I look. I know you are. He set her down gently. But I'm still going to treat you like you're precious, because you are. To me, you're everything. They stood there in the lamplight, holding each other, two broken people who'd found wholeness in each other. When should we get married? Charlotte asked. How about next week? I don't want to wait. What will people say about us rushing? I don't care what people say. Do you? Charlotte thought about Mrs. Pritchard and all the others who judged her. No, I don't care at all. Good. James kissed her forehead. Now go get some sleep. We have a wedding to plan. Will you kiss me good night first? He smiled and obliged, his kiss tender and full of promise. Charlotte floated up the stairs to her room, her heart so full she thought it might burst. She'd come to Wyoming territory with nothing but a trunk and a prayer, and she'd found everything she never knew she needed. The days leading up to the wedding passed in a blur of anticipation and preparation. Charlotte found herself humming while she worked, catching James watching her with that soft expression that made her heart flutter. The ranch hands had noticed the change between them and seemed genuinely happy about it, especially Tom, who confided to Charlotte one evening that he'd never seen the boss smile so much. He was a different man when he first came here, Tom had said, settling into a chair after supper while James was out checking the horses. Quiet, kept to himself. Angry at the world, I think. Whatever happened in the cavalry, it changed him, made him hard. What changed? Charlotte asked, pouring Tom more coffee. You did, Ma'am. Tom smiled. The moment you arrived, something shifted. He started caring about things beyond just the ranch, started planning for a future instead of just surviving day to day. Charlotte felt warmth spread through her chest at his words. She'd thought James had saved her, but maybe they'd saved each other. The night before the wedding, Charlotte couldn't sleep. She stood at her window looking out at the moonlit valley, thinking about how much her life had changed in just a few short months. This time tomorrow, she'd be Mrs. James Kincaid. The thought filled her with joy and a flutter of nervous excitement. A soft knock on her door made her turn. Charlotte, you still awake? It was James's voice, low and hesitant. She opened the door to find him standing there in his shirt sleeves, his dark hair disheveled, as if he'd been running his hands through it. I couldn't sleep either, he admitted. Nervous? She asked with a smile. Terrified, he said honestly. Not about marrying you, about being the husband you deserve. Charlotte reached out and took his hand, pulling him into her room. It was improper, but they were getting married tomorrow, and she needed him to understand something. James Kincaid, you listen to me, she said firmly, looking up at him. You are exactly the man I need. Not some perfect gentleman with polished manners and a spotless past. You, with all your scars and doubts and that big heart you try so hard to hide. He pulled her close, wrapping his arms around her. Charlotte rested her head against his chest, hearing the steady beat of his heart. I never thought I'd have this, James murmured into her hair. Never thought I deserved it. We both deserve happiness, Charlotte whispered, and we're going to have it together. They stood there for a long moment, holding each other in the moonlight, neither wanting to let go. I should go, James finally said, though he didn't move. It's bad luck to see the bride before the wedding. I think we've had enough bad luck for one lifetime, Charlotte replied. Maybe it's time for something good. He kissed her forehead, then her cheek, then finally her lips, soft and sweet and full of promise. Tomorrow, he whispered against her mouth. Tomorrow, you'll be mine forever. I'm already yours, Charlotte said. The wedding is just making it official. After he left, Charlotte finally fell asleep, a smile on her face and peace in her heart. The next morning dawned bright and clear, as if nature itself was celebrating. Charlotte woke to find a bouquet of wildflowers outside her door with a note in James's strong handwriting. For my bride, can't wait to see you, Jay. She pressed the note to her heart, feeling tears of happiness prick her eyes. The morning passed in a flurry of preparation. Charlotte bathed in the copper tub, washed her hair until it shone, and carefully put on the white dress she'd sewn. It was simple but elegant, fitted at the waist, with long sleeves and a modest neckline. She'd embroidered small flowers along the hem and cuffs, working on them late at night when she couldn't sleep. As she pinned her hair up, leaving a few soft curls to frame her face, she thought about her first marriage. It had been arranged by their families, more about duty and expectations than love. She'd cared for her husband, but she'd never felt this consuming passion, this deep certainty that she was exactly where she was meant to be. With James, everything was different. He'd chosen her when she had nothing. He'd seen her worth when the world had deemed her worthless, and she'd seen past his rough exterior to the gentle soul beneath. 1 week later, Charlotte stood in her room at the ranch, looking at herself in the small mirror. She was wearing a simple white dress she'd made from the fabric James had brought home weeks ago. Her hair was pinned up with wildflowers that she'd picked from the garden they'd planted together. There was a knock at the door. "Come in," she called. Tom stepped in, looking uncomfortable in a clean shirt and his Sunday best. "You look real pretty, Mrs. Meadows." "Thank you, Tom. Is everything ready?" "Yes, Ma'am. The minister's here, and the boss is waiting outside. He sent me to fetch you." Tom paused, then added with a gruff kindness, "I'm real happy for you both. The boss is a good man, and you're exactly what he needed." Charlotte felt her throat tighten with emotion. "Thank you, Tom. That means more than you know." Charlotte took a deep breath. "I'm ready." Tom offered his arm and led her downstairs and out to the front yard, where everyone was gathered. Jake and Samuel stood to one side, grinning. The minister, Reverend Harris, waited under an arch that the ranch hands had built and decorated with more wildflowers. And there was James. He was wearing a black suit that made him look even more handsome than usual. But it was the expression on his face when he saw her that took Charlotte's breath away. He looked at her like she was the only person in the world, like she was everything he'd ever wanted. Tom walked her over and placed her hand in James's. His hand was warm and steady, and Charlotte felt all her nervousness fade away. "You're beautiful," James whispered. "You clean up pretty well yourself," she replied with a smile. The ceremony was short and simple. When the Reverend asked if James would take Charlotte as his wife, he said, "I do," in a voice that rang with certainty. When it was Charlotte's turn, she looked into James's blue-gray eyes and said, "I do," with all her heart. "I now pronounce you man and wife," Reverend Harris said. "You may kiss your bride." James cupped Charlotte's face in his hands and kissed her gently, sweetly, while Tom and the boys cheered. When they broke apart, James kept his forehead pressed to hers. "Mine," he whispered. "Yours," Charlotte agreed. "Always yours." That evening, after the ranch hands had retired to the bunkhouse and the Reverend had ridden back to town, Charlotte and James sat together on the porch swing, watching the sunset over the mountains. "Happy?" James asked, his arm around her shoulders. "More than I ever thought possible," Charlotte said, nestled against his side. "Who would have thought that getting turned down for 5 jobs would lead to this?" "I think it was fate," James said. "You were meant to walk down that street. I was meant to see you. We were meant to find each other. You believe in fate now. I believe in you," he said simply. "And I believe that sometimes broken people are meant to find each other and make each other whole." Charlotte turned to look at him. "You made me whole again, James. When I came here, I was just surviving. Now I'm living, really living. You did the same for me." He kissed her softly. "I spent 5 years building this ranch, making it successful, but it was never a home until you walked through that door. It's our home now," Charlotte said. "And we're going to fill it with love and laughter and maybe someday children." James's eyes lit up. "You want children, don't you?" "I do. I just didn't think—" "I mean, you'd trust me to be a father?" "You'll be a wonderful father," Charlotte said firmly, "just like you're a wonderful husband." He pulled her closer, and they sat there as the stars began to appear in the darkening sky. As the evening deepened, James took Charlotte's hand and led her inside. The house was quiet, lit only by the soft glow of oil lamps. He'd spent the afternoon making sure everything was perfect, while she was getting ready with Tom's help, keeping him occupied elsewhere. "I have something for you," James said, his voice slightly nervous. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small wooden box. Charlotte opened it to find a delicate gold locket. "James, it's beautiful. It was my mother's," he said quietly. "The only thing I have left of her. I want you to have it." Tears filled Charlotte's eyes. "Are you sure? She would have loved you," James said, his voice thick with emotion. "She would have said you were exactly what I needed. Strong and kind and brave." He took the locket and fastened it around Charlotte's neck, his fingers gentle against her skin. "Now you'll always have a piece of my family with you, and soon we'll start our own." Charlotte turned in his arms and kissed him, pouring all her love and gratitude into it. When they pulled apart, James rested his forehead against hers. "I love you, Charlotte Kincaid," he whispered, "more than I ever knew it was possible to love someone." "I love you too," she breathed, "with everything I am." They stood there in the soft lamplight, two people who'd found their way to each other through hardship and hope, now bound together for the rest of their lives. The weeks following the wedding fell into a new, sweeter rhythm. Charlotte still woke before dawn to make breakfast, but now James woke with her, stealing kisses in the kitchen while coffee brewed. The ranch hands pretended not to notice the way the boss's hand would linger on his wife's shoulder, or how he'd find any excuse to be near her during the day. One morning, about 3 weeks after the wedding, Charlotte was in the garden when she heard a wagon approaching. She straightened, shading her eyes against the sun, and saw an unfamiliar rig coming up the drive. James emerged from the barn, his posture immediately alert and protective. He walked over to Charlotte, placing himself slightly in front of her as the wagon drew closer. It was a well-dressed couple, the woman perhaps in her 50s, the man a few years older. As they climbed down, Charlotte noticed the woman's sharp eyes taking in everything about the ranch, settling finally on Charlotte herself. "Can I help you?" James asked, his tone polite but guarded. The man removed his hat. "We're looking for Mrs. Charlotte Meadows. We were told she might be working on this ranch." Charlotte's heart began to pound. She stepped forward. "I'm Charlotte, though it's Charlotte Kincaid now." The woman's eyebrows rose. "You married?" "3 weeks ago," James said, moving closer to Charlotte's side. "And you are?" "I'm Margaret Hartford," the woman said. "Your late husband's aunt, Charlotte. This is my husband, William." Charlotte felt the blood drain from her face. She'd never met this aunt, but she knew of her. Margaret Hartford was wealthy, influential, and by all accounts, formidable. "What brings you all the way to Wyoming?" Charlotte asked, trying to keep her voice steady. Margaret's expression softened slightly. "I came looking for you, dear. When I heard what happened after my nephew's death, how his creditors took everything, and his immediate family abandoned you, I was appalled." "That was a year ago," Charlotte said quietly. "Yes, well, I was traveling in Europe at the time. I only learned of it when I returned 2 months ago." Margaret reached into her reticule and pulled out a thick envelope. "I've brought you what's rightfully yours." Charlotte stared at the envelope. "I don't understand." "Your husband had a trust fund from his grandfather, my father. The creditors couldn't touch it because it was in a separate legal entity. It should have gone to you upon his death, but his parents kept it quiet, probably hoping to claim it themselves." Margaret's voice was sharp with disapproval. "It's not a fortune, but it's enough to ensure you'll never want for anything again. $15,000. Charlotte's knees went weak. James's arm came around her waist, steadying her. "15,000, Charlotte whispered. "Plus interest," William added. "We've had our lawyers working on this for weeks. It's all legal and proper." Margaret studied Charlotte carefully. "When I started searching for you, I feared I'd find you in desperate circumstances, but it seems you've landed on your feet." Her gaze moved to James, assessing. "Your husband?" "James Kincaid, ma'am," James said, extending his hand. "I own this ranch." William shook it firmly. "A pleasure. You've clearly taken good care of Charlotte." "She takes care of herself," James said with a hint of pride in his voice. "I just gave her a place to do it." Margaret's stern expression cracked into a smile. "I like you, Mr. Kincaid. You don't coddle her or treat her like a fragile thing." She turned back to Charlotte. "I can see you're happy here. That's all I needed to know. The money is yours to do with as you please. If you want to invest it, William can recommend some excellent opportunities. If you want to save it, that's fine too. It's yours, free and clear." Charlotte looked at the envelope in her hands, then at James, then back at Margaret. "I don't know what to say. Thank you doesn't seem like enough." "Then don't say anything," Margaret replied. "Just be happy. That's all any of us really need." She paused, then added, "I'm sorry about what his family did to you. They were wrong, and I told them so. You deserved better." "I have better now," Charlotte said softly, looking at James. The older couple stayed for dinner, and Charlotte found herself genuinely enjoying their company. Margaret had a sharp wit and a kind heart beneath her formidable exterior, and William was gentle and thoughtful. They told stories about Charlotte's late husband as a child, giving her glimpses of the boy he'd been before life had complicated things. As they prepared to leave, Margaret pulled Charlotte aside. "You know, dear, when I set out to find you, I half expected to have to rescue you from some terrible situation. Instead, I find you've rescued yourself." "James helped," Charlotte said. "I'm sure he did. But from what I can see, you would have found a way regardless. You're stronger than my nephew ever was. God rest his soul." Margaret squeezed Charlotte's hand. "Use that money wisely. Build something good. And if you ever need anything, you write to me. We're family, whether the rest of them acknowledge it or not." After they left, Charlotte and James stood on the porch, watching the wagon disappear down the road. $15,000, Charlotte said wonderingly. I never even knew it existed. What do you want to do with it? James asked. Charlotte thought for a moment, then smiled. I want to invest half of it in the ranch. Make it ours, not just yours. I want to help it grow. Charlotte, you don't have to. I want to, she interrupted. This is our home, our future. I want to be a real partner in it. She paused, then added, and I want to use some to build a school in Silver Creek. There are children there who need one, and the town can't afford it on its own. James pulled her into his arms. You're remarkable, you know that. I'm practical, Charlotte corrected, and I remember what it was like to have nothing. I don't ever want to be helpless like that again, and I don't want anyone else to be either. Then we'll do it, James said. Together. The months passed, bringing summer's heat and then autumn's cool relief. Charlotte and James worked side by side, expanding the ranch with her investment. They bought more cattle, repaired the barn, and built a new bunkhouse for additional ranch hands they planned to hire come spring. Charlotte also made good on her promise to help Silver Creek. She worked with the town council to build a small schoolhouse and hire a teacher. When it opened in late October, she was there to see the children's excited faces as they filed in for their first day. Mrs. Pritchard was conspicuously absent from the ceremony, but Evelyn came, pulling Charlotte aside afterward. I'm sorry, Evelyn said quietly, for how my mother treated you, for how I stood by and let her. You were in a difficult position, Charlotte said generously. That's no excuse. You've done something wonderful here. The whole town is talking about your generosity. Evelyn smiled. And about how happy you are with your husband. I see him looking at you. That's real love, Charlotte. I'm glad you found it. As winter approached, Charlotte discovered she was pregnant. She told James one evening as they sat by the fire, his arms around her as they watched the flames dance. I'm going to have a baby, she said simply. James went completely still. Then he turned her to face him, his blue-gray eyes wide with wonder. Are you sure? I'm sure. The doctor in town confirmed it yesterday when you thought I was just buying supplies. We're going to have a baby, James repeated, his voice filled with awe. Then he was kissing her, laughing and crying at the same time, holding her like she was the most precious thing in the world. I'm going to be a father, he whispered against her hair. Charlotte, you've given me everything. A home, a purpose, love, and now this. We've given each other everything, Charlotte corrected, her hand over his on her still flat belly. This baby is the beginning of our family, James. The family we both deserve. That winter was the happiest Charlotte had ever known. Despite the cold and the snow, the house was warm with love and laughter. Tom and the boys were delighted about the baby, already making plans for a cradle and arguing about whether it would be a boy or girl. James became even more protective, constantly worried that Charlotte was working too hard. She had to remind him daily that she was pregnant, not fragile, and that women had been having babies since the beginning of time. I know that, he'd say, pulling her close. But you're my woman, carrying my child. Let me worry about you. It makes me feel useful. On Christmas morning, Charlotte woke to find James already awake, watching her with that soft expression that still made her heart skip. Merry Christmas, Mrs. Kincaid, he murmured, kissing her forehead. Merry Christmas, she replied, snuggling closer to his warmth. I have something for you, he said, reaching over to the bedside table. He handed her a small wooden box, beautifully carved with flowers. Inside was a ring, a simple gold band with a small diamond. I know we already have wedding rings, James said, but I wanted to give you something special, something that shows you how much you mean to me. Charlotte's eyes filled with tears as he slipped it on her finger next to her wedding band. It's perfect. I love it. I love you. I love you too, he whispered. You and our little one. You're my whole world, Charlotte. They spent Christmas Day with the ranch hands, sharing a feast that Charlotte had prepared with help from everyone. There was laughter and singing, and for the first time in years, both Charlotte and James felt truly at peace. That night, as they lay in bed, Charlotte's head on James's chest, she thought about the journey that had brought her here. The loss, the desperation, the fear, and then the hope, the love, the joy. What are you thinking about? James asked, his hand gently stroking her hair. About how lucky I am. I'm the lucky one, he said. "You could have married anyone, but you chose a broken cavalry scout with more scars than charm. You have plenty of charm, and I didn't choose you despite your scars, James. I chose you because of everything you are, the good, the bad, the broken, and the beautiful. All of it, all of you." James turned her in his arms and kissed her deeply, passionately. When he pulled back, his voice was rough with emotion. "I love you, Charlotte Kincaid. I love you too," she whispered. The future stretched out before them, full of promise and possibility. Charlotte thought about that desperate woman who'd stood on the street in Silver Creek, wondering what would become of her. She'd had nothing then, no money, no prospects, no hope, but now she had everything. She had a home, a purpose, and most importantly, she had James. "What are you thinking about?" James asked. "About how lucky I am." "I'm the lucky one," he said. "You could have married anyone, but you chose a broken cavalry scout with more scars than charm. You have plenty of charm, and I didn't choose you despite your scars, James. I chose you because of everything you are, the good, the bad, the broken, and the beautiful. All of it, all of you." James turned her in his arms and kissed her deeply, passionately. When he pulled back, his voice was rough with emotion. "I love you, Charlotte Kincaid. I love you too," she whispered. And as they sat there together, watching the night sky, Charlotte knew that this was just the beginning. They would face challenges, certainly. They would have hard days and difficult times, but they would face them together, two souls who'd found each other against all odds. She'd turned down 5 job offers that day in Silver Creek. No, she'd been turned down 5 times. But the 6th opportunity, the one James had offered, had changed everything. Sometimes the best things in life came when you least expected them. Sometimes you had to lose everything to find what really mattered. And sometimes love found you in the most unlikely places. For Charlotte, love had found her on a dusty street in a frontier town, in the form of a tall cowboy with blue-grey eyes and a heart big enough to hold all her broken pieces. And she'd never been more grateful for anything in her entire life. The spring arrived with renewed hope and new beginnings. Charlotte's belly had grown round with their child, and James treated her like she was made of spun glass, much to her amusement and occasional frustration. "I'm just pregnant, James, not dying," she'd tell him when he insisted on carrying even the lightest basket. "Humour me," he'd reply, stealing a kiss. "I've waited my whole life for this. Let me enjoy taking care of you both." One warm April afternoon, Charlotte was resting in the rocking chair James had made for her when her water broke. James had been out checking the fence line, but Tom ran to get him, riding faster than Charlotte had ever seen the older man move. James burst through the door, his face pale. "Charlotte, it's time," she said calmly, though her heart was racing. "Send Tom for the doctor." The next 12 hours were the longest of James's life. He paced outside the bedroom door, listening to Charlotte's labored breathing and occasional cries of pain. Tom and the boys tried to distract him with talk of the ranch, but nothing could take his mind off what was happening beyond that closed door. Finally, as dawn was breaking, he heard it, the sharp, indignant cry of a newborn baby. The door opened, and the doctor smiled at him. "Congratulations, Mr. Kincaid. You have a healthy baby girl." James's knees nearly gave out with relief. "And Charlotte, she's tired but doing well. You can go in now." James entered the room to find Charlotte propped up in bed, her hair damp with sweat, her face exhausted but radiant. And in her arms was the tiniest, most perfect thing he'd ever seen. "Meet your daughter," Charlotte whispered, her eyes shining with tears of joy. James approached slowly, reverently, as if he were approaching something sacred. He looked down at the baby, at her tiny fingers and rosebud mouth, at the downy dark hair that was already showing signs of curl like his own. "She's perfect," he breathed. "You're both perfect." "Would you like to hold her?" Charlotte asked. James nodded, unable to speak. Charlotte carefully placed the baby in his large, work-roughened hands. The infant was so small, she fit in his palms with room to spare. "Hello, little one," James whispered, his voice cracking with emotion. "I'm your papa, and I promise I'm going to spend every day of my life making sure you and your mama are happy and safe and loved." The baby yawned, her tiny fist curling around James's finger with surprising strength. He looked at Charlotte, tears streaming down his face. "Thank you," he said. "Thank you for giving me everything I never knew I needed." Charlotte smiled, exhausted but happy. What should we name her? They'd discussed names for months but hadn't been able to decide. Now, looking at his daughter, James knew exactly what her name should be. Rose, he said, after my mother, Rose Marie Kincaid. Rose Marie, Charlotte repeated, testing the name. It's perfect. Over the next weeks, the ranch became a different place. Rose's cries echoed through the house at all hours, and James learned to function on very little sleep. He'd wake in the night to find Charlotte nursing their daughter by lamplight, humming soft lullabies, and his heart would swell with so much love he thought it might burst. Tom and the boys were completely smitten with little Rose. They took turns whittling toys for her and arguing good-naturedly about who she resembled more. She's got the boss's eyes, Samuel insisted. But Charlotte's nose, Jake countered. She's got both their stubborn streaks, Tom said with a laugh. Poor thing doesn't stand a chance. When Rose was 3 months old, Margaret and William Hartford came to visit. Margaret took one look at the baby and immediately proclaimed her the most beautiful child she'd ever seen. She looks like you did as a baby, Charlotte, Margaret said, holding Rose with surprising gentleness for such a formidable woman. Though I see her father in her too, that determined set to her jaw. She's going to be trouble, William said with an indulgent smile. I can tell already. The best kind of trouble, James agreed, watching his daughter with undisguised adoration. As summer arrived, Charlotte and James settled into their roles as parents. Rose grew and thrived, her personality emerging more each day. She was curious and fearless, trying to grab everything within reach, and she had a smile that could melt the hardest heart. One evening, as they sat on the porch watching the sunset with Rose sleeping peacefully in Charlotte's arms, James reflected on how much his life had changed. You know what I was thinking about today? He asked. What's that? That day in Silver Creek, when I saw you walking out of that restaurant. If I'd been 1 minute later, if I'd gone to the feed store first instead of the saddle shop, if I'd decided not to approach you, our whole lives would be different. Charlotte shifted Rose slightly and leaned against James's shoulder. But you weren't late. You were exactly where you were supposed to be, when you were supposed to be there. You really believe that? In fate, I believe that sometimes life gives us exactly what we need, even if it doesn't look like what we expected. She looked down at Rose, then up at James. I expected to find a job that day. I found a home, a family, a love I didn't even know existed. James kissed her softly. I expected to hire a housekeeper. I found my everything. As the years passed, Kincaid Ranch continued to prosper. They hired more hands as the herd grew, and Charlotte's school in Silver Creek flourished, eventually adding 2 more teachers. Rose grew into a bright, spirited child who could ride a horse before she could write her own name, and who followed her father around like a devoted shadow. 2 years after Rose was born, Charlotte gave birth to twins, 2 boys they named Samuel James and Thomas William, after the ranch hands who'd become like family, and William Hartford, who'd helped them invest their money wisely. The house was always full of noise and laughter now. Rose helped her mother in the garden and learned to bake bread. The twins toddled after their father and the ranch hands, getting into everything with that special talent young boys had for finding trouble. James had never imagined he could be this happy. The angry, lonely man who'd left the cavalry all those years ago seemed like a different person entirely. Charlotte had healed something in him he hadn't even known was broken. One evening, when Rose was 7 and the twins were 5, the family gathered around the dinner table. Rose was excitedly telling them about a book she'd been reading. The twins were arguing about who could eat faster, and Charlotte was trying to maintain some semblance of order while fighting back laughter. James looked around at his family, at his beautiful wife who still took his breath away, at his children who filled his days with purpose and joy, and felt overwhelmed with gratitude. "What are you thinking about?" Charlotte asked, catching his expression. "About how you saved me," James said simply. "I think we saved each other," Charlotte replied, reaching across to squeeze his hand. Rose looked up from her book. "Papa, tell us the story again." "What story, sweetheart?" "About how you and Mama met, about the 5 jobs." James smiled. It had become their favorite bedtime story. "Well," he began. "It was a hot summer day in Silver Creek, and your mama was looking for work." As he told the story, their story, Charlotte listened with a smile. It had been nearly 8 years since that fateful day, but she remembered every detail as if it were yesterday. The desperation, the fear, the moment she'd looked up to see a tall cowboy watching her with intense blue-gray eyes. That day had changed everything. One decision, one moment of courage on both their parts had led to all of this. A thriving ranch, a loving family, a life filled with purpose and joy. After the children were in bed, Charlotte and James stood on the porch as they often did, watching the stars come out over the mountains. "Do you ever miss your old life?" James asked. "The society parties, the fancy dresses, the social circles." Charlotte laughed. "You mean the life where I was judged on my husband's success and treated like a decoration? Where my worth was measured in family connections and dinner party skills?" She turned to face him. "I don't miss it for a second. This life, this family, this love, it's real. It's mine, ours. I worked for it, earned it, chose it. That makes it worth more than all the fancy parties in the world. You never regret it? The hardship you went through to get here?" Charlotte thought about that. The loss, the grief, the fear, the months of uncertainty. "No," she said finally, "because all of that led me here, to you, to our children, to this life. And I wouldn't trade a single day of it." James pulled her close, holding her tight. "I love you, Charlotte Kincaid, more with each passing day." "I love you too," she whispered. "My cowboy, my love, my home." They stood there under the stars, two people who'd found each other against all odds, who'd built a life together from nothing but hope and hard work and love. Their story had started with 5 rejections and 1 unexpected offer, and it had become something beautiful. Behind them, through the window, they could see the warm glow of lamplight in their home. Inside, their children slept safely. Around them, the ranch stretched out into the darkness, a testament to what they'd built together. Charlotte thought about that desperate young widow who'd stood on a dusty street in Silver Creek, wondering what would become of her. If she could go back and tell that woman what the future held, she wouldn't believe it. She wouldn't believe that such happiness was possible, that love could be so deep and true, that life could be so full. But it was. It all was. And as James kissed her under the starlight, Charlotte knew with absolute certainty that she was exactly where she was meant to be, with exactly who she was meant to be with. Her journey had been hard, but it had led her home, not to a place, but to a person, to James, to their family, to the life they'd created together, one day at a time, with courage and hope and an abundance of love. Some might say she'd been lucky that day in Silver Creek, lucky that James had been watching, that he'd approached her, that he'd offered her a job. But Charlotte knew better. It wasn't luck. It was something far more powerful. It was 2 broken souls recognizing each other, 2 people who'd lost their way, finding the path forward together. 2 hearts that had been closed opening up to the possibility of love. It was, Charlotte thought, as James held her close, exactly what they both needed when they needed it most. And that was worth more than all the luck in the world. Years later, when her grandchildren would ask her about the happiest day of her life, Charlotte would smile and tell them it wasn't just one day. It was every day since that hot afternoon when a tall cowboy had watched her get turned down for the 5th time and asked, "What kind of work are you looking for, Mom?" Because that question had led to everything. It had led to this life, this love, this legacy, and she wouldn't change a single moment of it.